And thank you all for having me here and for turning out on what's not such a horrible night for Chicago. So I know I'm from Wisconsin, so I know what the weather can be like in this part of the world. I want to start by telling you a story, and it's a story that begins once upon a time. So once upon a time, there was a large, very poor, but resource-rich country that was just emerging from a period of intense conflict. And they decided to focus on development. We need to modernize our infrastructure. We need to modernize our technologies. We need to rebuild our ports. We need to modernize our mines. Soon they had a visitor from a rich Asian nation that had already become a major consumer of their oil. And so this Asian nation said to them, let's make a bargain. We'll offer you a $10 billion line of credit. And you can use it to import our technologies. Our companies can help you modernize your mines and build your infrastructure. And you can repay us with your oil. So many people in this poor country were very suspicious of this Asian power. But they agreed to the bargain, and the work began. So which two countries am I talking about? This is where I usually get mumbles, mumbles. All right, so clearly one of them was China. China was a large, poor country with oil. And the other country was Japan. And the time was 30 years ago, and China was emerging from the Cultural Revolution. And they formed this bargain. Now, when Deng Xiaoping first proposed this in China in 1975, it was intensely controversial. But he prevailed, and China went on to prosper, and this relationship helped. So, there are several points here that relate to China's current engagement in Africa. The first is that this was not altruism on Japan's part. This was not foreign aid. This was not even a concessional line of credit, although some of those came later. But most importantly, and second, is that China's leaders saw this as an opportunity to use their own resources and transform them into development, things that they wanted for their own modernization. They took charge of it. And Japan was pleased to get access to China's oil, of which they became the major importer, and their coal, and sell them advanced technology and Japanese engineering services. And the rest, as they say, is history. So I hope you were surprised by this story. Were you? Yes. Yes. Thank you. It's one of many surprises in this book. China's offering the same bargain to many African countries today. It's a hard-nosed bargain. It's not a bargain out of good-heartedness, necessarily, but they're saying leverage what you have. If you're Ghana, leverage your cocoa. If you're Ethiopia, leverage your sesame. If you're Congo, Brazzaville, leverage your oil. Leverage these resources and use them to build up what you think you need for your country's modernization. If it's a power plant, if it's a modern port, if it's a number of hospitals, schools across your country, polytechnics, as they're getting in Angola. On hearing of one major deal being developed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the editor of the Financial Times in 2007 said, Beijing has thrown down its most direct challenge yet to the West's architecture for aiding African development. And I think he was right. But this challenge is not just about things like debt sustainability, low environmental standards, low safety and labor standards, and social standards of Chinese companies. All of these are important issues, and they exist. But it's more fundamentally about how the aid and development finance architecture does structure our engagement with Africa and how it might change. So this book is about Chinese aid and state-sponsored economic engagement in Africa. And at the start, I had a more academic title. It was going to be something like Chinese strategic partnerships in Africa or something kind of boring. But while I was off doing field work in Sierra Leone, or maybe it was in Zambia or Tanzania, my editor put the proposal forward to her board, and she changed the title unilaterally. And I later looked at the contract, and I saw they have that right. They have the last word on these things. And she changed it to Rogue Donor with a question mark, the real story of China and Africa. And when I heard about it, I was taken aback, and I said, oh, this is a terrible title. But the title went into one of the catalogs, and it's still floating around on the internet. You can see it if you Google it. And so I did get them to change it. We had to make compromises. I'm not that happy with the real story. It's kind of hubristic and sets me up for a fall. But in any case, my editor was very annoyed with me, and particularly when the book came out, because it came out within a week in England of Sarah Palin's memoir. And as you know, her memoir is called Going Rogue. My book was going to be called Rogue Donor, and my editor thought we could have had some tie-ins with right on the coattails of the rogue VP candidate from Alaska. But seriously, I wrote this book out of a mixture of alarm and scholarly curiosity. Both the West and China present distorted images of this engagement. If you look at the Chinese media on their relationship with Africa, it's presented in wholly positive lines. It's along the lines of, we are good friends who help each other. China is a sincere partner. The Tanzam Railway is regularly trotted out as an example of China's selfless intentions toward the continent. But in reality, Chinese companies are down in the dirt doing deals and giving kickbacks and wrestling with African governments like all the companies from around the world that operate in Africa. And on the other hand, in the West, we read about Chinese engagement in Africa, and it's almost wholly negative. We read that the Chinese are the new colonialists, that their aid is toxic, and they're making poverty worse. We read that China gives billions in aid to prop up pariah regimes in Sudan and Zimbabwe, that China's leading the charge to grab huge swaths of land across Africa, or that they bring in all their own labor and don't hire Africans. And in fact, almost all of that is not true, as you'll see in the book. So, how did I do this research? Well, as Richard pointed out, I've been actually working on this kind of topic for a long time. My first book was on Chinese aid and African agriculture. And that book sank like a stone. I could tell you, nobody was interested in that topic at the time. But I started out as a sinologist, a person who studies China. Chinese was my language in graduate school. And because I've been working on this for a long time, I can tell you that the Chinese government does not make this kind of research easy at all. Aid is a state secret, or it isn't probably a state secret anymore. There are things that are, levels of punishment rise for divulging information, whether it's a state secret or whether it's just confidential. But it's not published. The aid to Africa isn't published. The financial flows to Africa are rarely published. There are little bits and pieces here and there that you can knit together. But if you do knit those together, if you do go into the Chinese sources, if you do interviews, you can learn a lot about what China is doing. And of course, you have to go to Africa, which I did. I went to the difficult country of Mauritius, again. And I also went to Nigeria. I went to Zimbabwe and South Africa, Tanzania, Zambia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique on this current research. And in past years, I've looked at this topic in Liberia and the Gambia as well. So I've covered it in quite a few countries. And when I was writing this book, I often felt like Akira Kurosawa, the famous Japanese film director. And it's not because I'm, famous or so great, but he does this wonderful film, Rashomon, which many of you have seen. And in this film, he shows an event that happens in the woods. And he shows it from one perspective, and you're quite sure what happened. And then he shows it from another perspective, and you think, well, maybe that's what happened. And then he shows it from a third perspective. And at the end, what you know is that you're not quite sure what happened, but you're very sure that your first impression was not the right one. And I think we need to look at China from a number of different perspectives. Although my book is called The Real Story, it's one perspective. It is based on quite a few years of experience and a background both in Africa and in China. But it's my perspective. And when you read the book, I hope you'll bring to it your own perspective. I hope it will change, as it seems to have with Richard. But what I've done in the book is I deconstruct a lot of the conventional wisdom that has arisen around the topic of China and Africa. There are many, many myths and many realities about this engagement. And I only have time for a few tonight. So let me address 4. And the first is that China is a new donor in Africa. Now, most of the people in this room know that's not the case, that China's not new. They've been there for more than 50 years. But why does this matter? It matters because the Chinese actually have a lot of experience in Africa, and they have been analyzing their own past failed experience in the past, their past failed aid projects, and they've come up with a different model of engagement, which is what I talk about a lot in the book. And most of this does not actually involve foreign aid. It's a transition from aid to economic engagement of various kinds, and we'll return to this. But China's long history in Africa gives them a lot of credibility. I often hear from people who don't know much about this that the Chinese came, they built the Tanzam Railway in Tanzania and Zambia, and maybe a few stadiums, and then they left. And they only came back when they needed oil. But this is one of the enduring myths about Chinese engagement in Africa. They scaled back, but they didn't leave. We just weren't looking. And if you went there, as I did in the 80s and 90s, you would find them. And the first 3 chapters of the current book focus on the history of this engagement and step by step how it builds up till today and how it transforms in the going global policies that were announced earlier in this decade, and how they learn from their own experience as a recipient of aid and loans from the West and from Japan in China, and how this affects their engagement in Africa today. It's very different from the aid consensus in the West. And so that's one thing I wanted to do. The second myth: Chinese aid is huge. This is probably the biggest, most repeated error on this topic. For example, a report done by the World Bank, which is a pretty good report on Chinese infrastructure engagement in Africa. They say in this report that between 1960 and 2006, China had given Africa $44 billion in aid. So if you had read that, you might have thought, well, that's probably about right. But when I saw that, because I'd written a book on this topic earlier, I thought, this is way off. And so I went to their sources. Where did they get this information? It was a Dow Jones report on a visit that Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao did to North Africa in 2006. And so I thought, well, maybe I can find some other reports on this visit. And so I looked into the Chinese media. They also reported on the visit. And they said that Wen Jiabao had said China had given 44 billion renminbi. And so I thought, whoa, this is a big difference. That's about $5.6 billion instead of $44 billion. So this is a big order of magnitude. And these kinds of sums are getting repeated, and they cycle around the internet, and then they're picked up even by respected researchers at the World Bank who don't know enough to tackle them. There are many examples of this. The editor of Foreign Policy published in the New York Times an op-ed in which he said that China had given $9 billion in aid for one project in Nigeria. This was the railroad, Richard, you know about this. And actually, when I went to Nigeria and looked into this, I found that although a Chinese company had a contract to rebuild a railroad from Kano to Lagos for $8.3 billion, the Chinese had put only $500 million in financing on the table, and this was a general credit that might be used for this railroad. There was another $2 billion in financing linked to oil concessions, which never was even signed. So there was some financing there. None of it technically was aid at all, because it wasn't. It was an export credit, although it was concessional. So this $9 billion down to $500 million. $500 million is actually only about 6% of $9 billion. It's a very different kind of figure. Aid is not big, but Chinese economic engagement is. Trade, for example, in 2008, it was $106 billion two-way trade. This compares, it makes China the number 2 trade partner with Africa, number 2 to us, and we were about $120 billion in 2008. Investment is also up hugely, although we don't have very good figures for that. The Chinese publish figures on investment, but they aren't very good, and they don't reflect a lot of the data. And this is, I don't think it's because of some nefarious purpose. I think it's because, I'll tell you why. In the Chinese data for Latin America, the two biggest areas for Chinese investment, does anyone know what they are? Someone might think like Brazil or whatever. It's the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. And so what this is, when you look at the data flows, you know, Chinese investment is going off to these tax havens. And then from the tax havens, it goes off to other places around the world. And so we don't actually know what's actually coming out from China. If we could get it from the other countries, from the African countries, we would have more accuracy. But again, the data isn't very good from that direction either. So, myth 3. Chinese aid and engagement in Africa are all about oil or natural resources. Now, countering this myth is going to be one of the more controversial, probably the most controversial of my arguments. But I say this in particular because the data doesn't back this up, that it's all about it. It's very important, but let me give you the data. The evidence on aid, particularly the grants and zero-interest loans, which come from the Ministry of Commerce, is that it's primarily political. It is given to every country in Africa that recognizes Beijing as China. So if you recognize Taiwan as China, you don't get aid. If you recognize Beijing as China, you do. If you're South Africa, Mauritius, Botswana, far wealthier on a per capita basis than China, you still get these projects like 2 primary schools or a health clinic or a stadium or something along those lines. These are political, they're prestige projects, they're for diplomacy. And it's widely spread across the continent. Chinese aid is spread more widely to more countries than aid from Western donors. And that's because Western donors tend to have their favorites. They're donor favorites and then donor orphans. The British don't give much to the Francophone countries. The French don't give much to the Anglophone countries, and so on. And the Chinese spread it across to all of the countries. Now, what about the large loans that we see? $4.5 billion for Angola, or up to $9 billion for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And there are others, $2 billion in Equatorial Guinea. Aren't these aid? We often see them described as aid in the media. But, and even a recent paper by researchers at Chatham House described the Chinese loans in Angola, $4.5 billion and rising, as deeply concessional, which makes them sound like aid. But in fact, the researchers at Chatham House were wrong to call them deeply concessional. And that's because these loans are based on what's called LIBOR. How many of you know what LIBOR is? Gosh, very few. Well, this is the case with most of the reporters that are working on this topic too. LIBOR is the London Interbank Offered Rate. It's a rate that banks use to give loans to each other, but it's also the base rate for a lot of variable loans because it changes. You can have 3-month LIBOR, 6-month LIBOR, 1-year LIBOR. So these loans are based on LIBOR, usually 1-year LIBOR. So it's LIBOR plus 1% or 100 basis points, LIBOR plus 2%. The loans in Angola are LIBOR plus 1.5%. This is a good rate, but it's not foreign aid. It's not concessional. It's a market rate. And it compares with rates that private banks were giving to Angola, which was LIBOR plus 2.5%. So a difference of 1 percentage point there. The Chinese don't describe these loans as foreign aid. They describe them as economic cooperation or part of their economic engagement. Finally, oil and minerals are a huge part of Chinese interest in Africa. I don't mean to deny that at all. But year to year, infrastructure contracts that are signed by Chinese companies in Africa are far larger than any of the estimates we have on investment. In 2008, for example, Chinese companies in Africa signed new construction contracts worth $40 billion just for that year. And they reported revenues of $20 billion just for 2008. And Chinese finance is paying for only a fraction of these. The others are paid by African governments or private companies in Africa that hire Chinese companies to build things for them, or the World Bank, the African Development Bank. Chinese companies now are winning the majority of the infrastructure contracts tendered by the African Development Bank, and they're rising rapidly in the World Bank's list. And many other donors who have helpfully untied their aid and now are watching Chinese companies win their contracts. Finally, China's single largest investment to date in Africa, does anyone know what it is or where it is? It's in South Africa, 20% of Standard Bank. So the single largest investment is about $5 billion, is 20% of a bank. And so that, it just shows the array of interests that Chinese companies have, in addition to oil and resources, and that the Chinese government has, political as well as economic. So, what impact has Chinese engagement had? This engagement has been rising so rapidly and in such a short amount of time that it's really difficult to give a rounded picture yet. And it would involve far more survey research than we have available to us at this point. But I focus on three areas in which I try to address what we think we know and then provide the evidence as much as I can. And that's in agriculture, industry, and governance. Three areas that I happen to be interested in also. There's also a lot in the book on infrastructure, but there's not a chapter particularly on that. Two chapters on agriculture give the background on Chinese engagement in that sector, the aid and how it transitions into business, but also deconstruct the myth that China is orchestrating large land deals across Africa. I was prepared to believe this because I know that Chinese companies have orchestrated large land deals in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, in the Philippines, and there was one that they tried to do in Laos. But when each time I dug into one of these supposed deals in Africa, it turned out to evaporate. And this was the case in Mozambique when I went there, in Zimbabwe when I went there, research that I did, I was in Zambia as well, and in Senegal. I didn't do the research in Senegal, but I checked out that case as well. And the only case that has substance to it is one in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's not, as it was described on CBS News' website recently, as China now having half of all the arable land in the DRC. This was a very large proposal for 3 million hectares to turn jungle land into oil palm. It would be a dreadful project. It was approved by the Congolese parliament, but at 100,000 hectares. So that is still quite large, but it's much smaller than 3 million hectares. That project is currently in abeyance, I think because the price of oil has dropped, and so doing oil palm for fuel oil doesn't make a lot of economic sense. It may start back up again. And if it does, and if there's further Chinese interest in this kind of large project, I would be very worried because I think this is not a helpful trend for Africa. But so far, I haven't seen a lot. And in fact, Chinese investors who have been looking at Africa and then going home again have been saying that they don't think African agricultural investment is, as one of them put it, a good chew on the bones. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think it means yummy. So, what about manufacturing? And how long should I speak? I should have asked that.
Well, I think another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, I can manage that. I was thinking about whether or not I should do a reading, but maybe I'll just let you guys, to give you a flavor of the book. But since I don't have a copy of it here, I'll just move into manufacturing. Chinese exports have been extremely tough for African manufacturing. I think that's clear. The data supports that kind of analysis, particularly in textiles. However, I think we need to look a little bit broader than to say that this has happened just overnight. African textile manufacturing has been in decline for 2 decades. In the 1980s, it was in the early 1980s, for example, in Nigeria, there were many healthy textile factories, and they've been going on a decline like this. Particularly in the mid-1990s, with structural adjustment and trade liberalization in a lot of countries, this opened the floodgates to imports. And this was all before China's export push, and the data on Chinese exports of textiles starts going up after the turn of the century. So it's only in the past decade. So, and then also there are a number of countries in which manufacturing over the past 5 years has been rising. So not in the textile sector necessarily, but manufacturing in general. So this is a hopeful sign. There are at least 12 of the more major economies in Africa for which manufacturing output has been on the rise. And some of this is due to Chinese investment. We don't have good data on Chinese investment in manufacturing in Africa. There are some surveys. The World Bank did a survey of 447 companies in 4 countries in Africa, and there were about 15 Chinese manufacturers there, so they've got some data on that, and others have done a little bit of work on this. But so far, we mainly have examples. We don't know how the data for FDI breaks down into the different sectors. So, but what we know is that Chinese equipment and machinery is the fastest growing sector in their exports. Now, this is going to involve things like bulldozers and caterpillars and things like that for construction. But it also involves machines for factories. And the Chinese government is promoting Chinese manufacturing investment in Africa. It's something that they want to encourage. Part of this is political, because they want to be seen as not just involved in resource extraction. But part of it is because it makes sense for some sectors to move closer to their sources of raw materials. In the leather sector, for example, it makes sense. And in some of the mineral processing sectors, it makes sense. And some Chinese companies have been coming over for rubber and for plastics as well. And there are other sectors too. So the Chinese government has set up an innovative $5 billion equity fund for Chinese companies to draw on to foster this investment in Africa. And they've also set up just very recently a $1 billion fund for African small and medium enterprises in order to foster joint ventures and investment, particularly in another tool that they have, which is 7 overseas economic zones. And many of you know that China started out in the transition by setting up overseas these special economic zones. Shenzhen is the most famous of them, but they're dotted up and down the coast. And now at this point, there are more than 100 special zones, industrial zones, technology zones, and other kinds of zones in Chinese cities around the country. So they look at this setting up of a zone as a positive thing for development. And they're doing 7 of these in Africa. So these are just starting. So we don't have information yet about how many Chinese companies will actually invest there. We do know that African companies, except in Mauritius, are welcome to invest in these zones, and other foreign companies are open. It's open to foreign companies as well because, and this is the interesting thing about these zones, they're all being set up by Chinese companies, not by the Chinese government. And the way this was structured was quite interesting. It was done through a series of competitive tenders. In 2006 and 2007, the Ministry of Commerce issued these notices, and 110 Chinese companies applied for support from the Ministry of Commerce to set up these zones as profitable enterprises, to then rent it out the spaces to other companies. Now, this is not just happening in Africa. The Chinese government has a plan to do 50 of these around the world. And so far, 19 have been approved, 7 for Africa. Now, this is an example of what the Chinese government learned about how to assist. That foreign aid just given to governments didn't seem to do much. Instead, they're using some of their resources to get Chinese companies to invest, to start producing jobs and start producing the start that could then turn into spillovers of technology if it works well. The downside is that if these companies stay as Chinese enclaves and are isolated, then these technology spillovers won't occur, and that's a real risk and a possibility. But it's still early. And then there are private African entrepreneurs and private Chinese entrepreneurs that are going into manufacturing and doing joint ventures. In Nigeria, I visited Innocent Chukwuma in Nnewi, which is an area Richard knows as well, that I have visited several times for research on industrial clusters. And this is my 4th trip to Nnewi, and they have strong ties to Asia in this area of Nigeria. It's in the old area that was Biafra, and it's just north of the Niger Delta. And so when I went there to visit first Innocent Chukwuma and a number of other factories there as well, this is a risky area. And he had 3 engineers kidnapped from one of his factories a couple of years ago. And 2 of them were Chinese. And so he sent me around in a car with 2 policemen with AK-47s on either side. I know Will Reno goes around like this all the time in Africa, but I wasn't used to this. So we traveled down closer and closer to the Delta area with these AK-47s, and fortunately nothing happened. But what I found was that Innocent Chukwuma has one enormous plastics complex of it's just building after building, and it's all producing plastics of various kinds. And I said to him as we walked around this factory, how can you compete with China? I have read in the newspapers that China's wiped out the plastics industry in Nigeria, but here you are, you're employing 1,000 Nigerians, you're producing all this plastic stuff. And he said, it's not that hard. He said, I actually have a tire factory in China, so I pay my workers in China and my workers here the same salary. So the salaries are the same. He said, I import all my equipment from China, so Chinese and I are using the same machines to produce our things. He said, I get my raw materials right here in Port Harcourt. It's not very far away, and it's produced in Nigeria. And he said, I have a distribution network. It goes all over Nigeria and the neighboring countries. And so he said, why wouldn't I be able to compete? So he was doing well. And not only that, he had formed joint ventures, not the plastics company, but a big tire factory and another assembly factory that he was doing for, he had motorcycles and vans. It was fascinating walking around to his various factories. And around there I saw several Chinese, not very many, but they were technicians that had come over to install the machinery. And part of the plan is that they have to install it themselves and then run it in order to have it guaranteed by the factory that produces the machinery. And then they go home. So, on governance. Many people argue that with China rising, progress in human rights and democracy and good governance in Africa will be reversed. And I predict that the impact of Chinese engagement is likely to be more marginal in this area than most people believe. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, because there's no evidence that the Chinese are more comfortable with authoritarian regimes than with democratic regimes. There's often been alleged, or seek them out particularly. Their largest trading partner in Africa has traditionally been South Africa. Just last year it became Angola because of the value of the oil they're importing. But they partner with Mauritius and Botswana and Ghana, some of Africa's most well-governed countries. And they also partner with Zimbabwe and Sudan and the DRC, some of Africa's worst-governed countries. But on this, and my second point is that China is not static. A lot of our impressions come from the time in 2005 or 2006, even 2007. But after all the blowback they got on the Darfur issue in Sudan and also in Zimbabwe, Chinese changed. And I show this in the book. In Sudan, the Chinese role has changed considerably. And it's interesting that both President Bush's special envoy for Darfur, Andrew Natsios, and President Obama's special envoy for Darfur, Scott Gratian, both say that China used to be part of the problem and now they're part of the solution, that they're actively working to get the Sudanese government to the peacekeeping table. And indeed, when I was in Africa, in Egypt, in November, at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Sharm el-Sheikh, which was an interesting experience. I had several Africans there asking me, why didn't China support us on the International Criminal Court decision of the UN Security Council to remand Bashir to the International Criminal Court? And I was surprised. I said, well, what do you mean China didn't support Africa on that? And they said to me, we did not support this move to remand Bashir to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. And China abstained. They could have vetoed it. Why didn't they veto it? And that's not what I usually hear here. I usually hear, China's supporting Sudan down the line. And the Africans are saying, why didn't China support? Several Africans were saying to me, why didn't China support Sudan on that? So it was an interesting perspective. And this is an African Union position. They were against this prosecution of Bashir in the International Criminal Court. And in Zimbabwe, I found that the Chinese were deeply tired of Mugabe. And they're deeply frustrated at the failure of their economic engagement there. And according to all independent sources, they had actually put very little money into the country. The economic office in Zimbabwe, the Chinese embassy, spent a lot of time running to the Zimbabwe Ministry of Finance trying to get payments for work that the Chinese companies have been contracted to do years earlier. One Chinese company there had been trying for 6 years to get a contract finalized to do a big power plant, a coal power plant in Hwange. And last week, Zimbabwe's Minister of Finance, Tendai Biti, who is a key member of the opposition in the inclusionary government, was in Washington. And I went to his talk and I asked him about Chinese support for Mugabe before and after the government. And he said, before and after the inclusive government, Chinese economic engagement was very minimal. He also commented that press reports of huge new Chinese deals in Zimbabwe were, quote, all fiction. Mugabe is like the Wizard of Oz. He projects this illusion to his people and to the rest of the world that he has this extensive Chinese support. But when you pull the curtain aside, you see actually he doesn't. So, Chinese companies that operate in resource-rich authoritarian governments like Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, are going to do all the same things that have been documented for Western companies in those countries. They're going to make shady deals. They're going to give kickbacks. They're going to disrespect the environment. They're going to resist the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Western companies have been improving in these areas, and there are signs that Chinese companies are starting to look at their reputational risk in this area, but they have a long way to go. But I'll make one more point on governance, and that is that the Chinese loans that I've been telling you about are actually less likely to be embezzled than loans from Western banks, or even than the policy loans that come from the World Bank or the IMF. Not the project, but the policy loans. And I argue in the book that this resource-backed infrastructure loan model, which basically is similar to what Japan did in China. It's a way of giving a line of credit that then is used to do development projects, infrastructure. And there are a number of different kinds of things: irrigation systems, water supply, power plants, a host of different kinds of things. And then pay for those with a natural resource. In the case of the DRC, that resource will be developed over time. In the case of Angola, it's the existing oil. This provides an agency of restraint. It's a credible commitment to development today. It locks some of a country's natural resources into development expenditures that probably wouldn't have been put there. And it does it in a way where the money stays in China. The Chinese do not give cash loans. They hold on to their money very tightly. As an African official said to me, with the Chinese, you never see that money. And this goes along with the tide aid. It goes along with the export credits, which is what these big lines of credit are. The Chinese and the African governments sit down together. They negotiate what will be done with the line of credit, what kinds of projects will come out of it and be financed by it. And in Angola, where they've been doing this since 2004, you can go to the Ministry of Finance website and you can see each one of the projects listed, where the financing comes from, how much it costs, where it's located. And it's quite interesting to see the variety there. So these deals have risks. Will the countries get value for money? Who's doing the costing on these projects? What about kickbacks from Chinese companies that are getting these contracts? Will they be maintained, the infrastructure? All of these are risks. But when you think about it, in the West, we've been importing oil from Angola for a long time. And we pay for that oil. It goes back to Sonangol, the state oil company, or the Angolan government. And who knows where it goes after that? None of it is connected to development directly. And this Chinese system, in a small way, has the potential to lock some of those resources in. So, in conclusion, Chinese aid and economic engagement in Africa is different from ours. And it's different for three reasons. It's different because, first, their core ideas about development are different. They're derived from China's own development experience. They're far less prescriptive than we are. We think we know how Africa can prosper. We have the recipe. But many of our certainties change every few years. The Chinese say at home, to get rich, build a road. And so they focus their aid on infrastructure. They believe agriculture is the foundation and industry is the leading edge. These are Chinese sayings. And so agriculture and industry have always been central to their engagement in Africa. And third, China's own experience as a recipient of aid and loans, particularly from Japan, influenced their thinking about how countries could use aid and development finance for mutual benefit. And finally, China is becoming an East Asian developmental state along the lines of Korea, Japan, Taiwan. We know what this looks like. It's state intervention to promote prosperity at home. We just haven't seen a country working like this in Africa on this scale. So the book is a window into a changing world, a rapidly changing world. It's a topic that I think has a lot of importance for Africa and for those who care about development on the continent. We can see China's rise as a threat, and there are a lot of problems associated with this. There's a lot more competition for African manufacturing. That's going to be tough. There's less regard for the environment, lower social standards, lower labor standards. And it's neutral, I would say, at best for governance. Or we can see it as an opportunity for Africa, for business engagement, for investment in areas outside of minerals and oil, as well as in manufacturing, and certainly for infrastructure, which is starting to transform many countries. But first of all, we need to understand it better. It's time to revise the conventional wisdom on what China's doing. This will help us engage more effectively with the Chinese and with our African partners. And that's why I wrote this book. And I hope you'll read it.
Okay.
So what should I do?
But you can stand here. I'll ask the first question.
All right. I might have to write these down.
And then, thank you ever so much. And like I said, that is just a little taste of what there is in the book. No, the question I want to ask you, by the way, some of the people present here are students in my course on aid, governance, and development.
Ah, that's how we got such a good turnout. I know how that works.
And, and I did say to them, well, two things I regret, that I didn't have a week that I can go away and just read, this book and work on it. And the other is that it wasn't published 3 to 4 months earlier, and I could have assigned it to my students. But anyway, we'll get around to that the next time. Now, the question I want to raise, going back to where you started off, with this pose about the Japan and China, and how that experience, and you do bring a lot of China's own experiences domestically as well as that to show how it operates externally, but to show how much that is reflected in China's own policy and thinking, right? And in fact, I did read that, she has a lot of interviews, by the way. One of the things that really spiced this up is all the interviews on the ground with individuals. But that Sierra Leonean official who said, but we can't see the money. And this is just after she explained this very complicated process of how, these projects are put together by China and so on. And when I saw that, when he said we can't see the money, it reminded me in Nigeria that there is a project that the Gates Foundation funded called APIN, and for AIDS prevention in Nigeria. This is a $25 million project, and in fact, one of our colleagues here, Robert Murphy, was involved in it. And I remember a journalist friend saying to me that when this announcement was made, and some of these intended colleagues first met with the team, their statement was, well, bring the money, And so we contrast that when we just think of not only the cataclysmic failure of development in Africa over a half century, but also the cataclysmic failure of Western aid, largely. Now, the question I have is, China has the whole toolkit. And in that toolkit, you also have, if you take the recent Namibian story with the scanners and so on, I mean, that's a toolkit of the kickbacks and the bribery and so on, right? So it has the whole toolkit. The question I would ask is, how could you, even if you're in a position to be working, a particular African government decide, hey, we're going to deal with the China, let's call Deborah Bräutigam here to give us some advice, all right? How could they try to really replicate that Japan-China model, right? So that after 10 to 20 years, we will actually see all of the things that China was able to do from that relationship happening in our case, and especially given all the disparities and so on,
I think you've kind of, hit the nail on the head there, Richard. It's interesting about, I was thinking about, I will answer that, but I was on the phone recently. I'm doing another paper on these special economic zones, a more detailed paper, and I was on the phone with the Nigerians who were doing one of the zones near Lagos. It's in the Lekki Peninsula. And I was asking them, how things were coming, and I got a very chatty guy on the other end, and he told me all of these interesting things, including, he said, tomorrow is really a showdown. We are going to demand that the Chinese actually produce the money because, they said they were going to invest $273 million in this zone. We haven't seen a penny yet. All they are bringing in is like equipment and manufacturing. They're doing construction, and we haven't seen any money, and we're going to this is it. Tomorrow is the showdown. It didn't actually happen. But I thought it was interesting in terms of they were hoping that they were going to see the cash, and then who knows what they were hoping to do with that. What would I really can't tell them to do anything. All I can do is they need to know what they want to do, and that's what China knew what they wanted to do, and so that's why it worked. And I can actually see in Angola. Angola knows what it wants to do. And the Angolans have a really nice list of things that they are having the Chinese do. Repairing all of these bridges. It's just like everything that they needed to do after the war. Putting the electricity systems back in, water purification, just a host of, that really was like a Marshall Plan in terms of, not that Angola was like Europe had been, but it really was reconstruction after the war. And that was a set of Angolan decisions. Now, in a place like Sierra Leone, I think they have that opportunity. There are Chinese companies interested in doing these resource-backed infrastructure deals there. There are discussions of them right now. In a number of other countries, these are possibilities. Ghana's using it in a little way to do this buoy hydropower plant that they wanted to do for a long, long time. And they're backing that with the cocoa revenues. But it's how do you see this as an opportunity? How can you sit down and focus? And it's about ownership. It's about figuring out what you want to do with this opportunity and how to make it run. But it's a big thing to ask. And it's hard. And it's hard for many of the reasons that you know so well, that countries are not just dealing with the Chinese. Every day they're dealing with all the donors, and they're dealing with all of the meetings, and they're dealing with the consultative groups. And it's to just sit down and focus on this one actor is hard, especially when the potential is quite large to do something in your country. How do you really focus on that?
Okay, let's open it up to questions, and then perhaps you could just field questions,
Sure.
Point. Go ahead. Yeah. Why don't we start with you, and then I'll let her get let's call the others.
In the Japan-China model, Japan was not a military power at the time. China is a major military power today. How much involvement of Chinese military arms sales and development of African military forces is going on right now?
I don't address that in the book because it's about economic engagement and not military. I do know a little bit about that, though, because I've read other studies of it. Chinese arms sales are a big area in Africa. If you look at the small arms trade, they're a major supplier. And they would like to break into the bigger areas. They've been using some preferential export credits to foster some of these, some of the jets that they sell, and they'd like to take over, like from the Harrier jets that a lot of Anglophone countries have been buying from the British. So they would like to break into that, which is a very lucrative, and they would like to take over from the West, and they're actually doing quite well at that. I think they may be one of second, or if not first, as an arms supplier in Africa. But that data comes from SIPRI, and that can be checked in the Stockholm database that SIPRI has. In terms of military engagement more broadly, there's not very much. There's some training activities. And some Chinese, when they sell equipment, they will send Chinese military people there to do trainings, and they might stay for a while and do training with that equipment. But in terms of, I've heard some people say that the Chinese have bases here and there in Africa. They have a satellite tracking base in Namibia, but it's very small. And there has been some discussion because now they're sending naval vessels. They have 2 naval vessels patrolling off Somalia in the trade routes there. And they've made some queries about setting up a base along the coast that can service those naval vessels. And people have been concerned that this might be a start of, like, the Blue Water Navy and the String of Pearls strategy and so on. I don't think their military engagement in Africa will get really large. It's not, there's not a pattern of Chinese military activity overseas aside from this more commercial side. The Cultural Revolution was an exception, but most of the time since 1949 we haven't seen that. It's been much more concerned about their border region. In the far back? Yes.
One of the significant developments I noticed in the last 20 years was the increased movement of Chinese people, not just the economic activity, but immigration, not only of professional category, but simply ordinary Chinese who are ready to rent a store in the marketplace and start retailing like every local is doing. What do you have in terms of studying this phenomenon, the immigration of Chinese people into African countries, and vice versa, also how many Africans have immigrated to China?
We don't have any hard data on this, but it is clearly on the rise. And I'll say a few things about it. The one piece of hard data that I have is in 2008, there were 140,000 Chinese working in Africa. And that's Chinese official figures. And so there clearly were more Chinese than that because those are the ones that were there officially and on the record. So most of those people will not stay. They will be there for 3 years and then go back, and others will take their place. But there is a large immigration. Now, a lot of it is temporary. A lot of it intends to be temporary but may not actually be temporary. There are many people that are going there sort of to make their fortune, and then they'll go back home. There's a lot of back and forth between Chinese traders that are going back and forth, just as African traders increasingly are going back and forth to China to buy their goods there. There's a whole African community now clustered around Macau of the Lusophone Africans and around Hong Kong of the Anglophone Africans. And then there's a mix between those two as well, who are there as traders. And some have set up companies in China. So the immigration into Africa, I see this as a cultural phenomenon for Chinese in general. If you look around the world, in major capital cities everywhere there are Chinatowns, and this has been the case for a long time. In 1949, when the People's Republic was founded, China shut off from the rest of the world, and Chinese citizens were not allowed to leave for the most part. And so there was a long period in which this whole kind of cultural networks of families and moving out was just stopped. And so this is opening up again. And so that's part of the phenomenon that we see in Africa. There are large Chinese communities in Africa that were there for 100 years or longer. South Africa, Mauritius, Madagascar, even smaller communities in Mozambique along that part of Africa, and some in Zimbabwe. And there, as I point out in the book, there are Sino-Africans who have risen up through the ranks to become ministers in various countries. So they have been a part of African communities for a long time, but not a hugely visible one. This new influx of Chinese traders is hugely threatening to many Africans who see this and resent it. Chinese traders are in Tanzania. I didn't actually see this when I was there. I went to look for them, but I was told Chinese traders were sitting on the pavement selling flowers, and that they were sitting down by the bus station selling peanuts and speaking Swahili. And saying, you know, koni, 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 to try to get people to come and buy their peanuts and their roasted yams or whatever it was they were selling. But I didn't see it. I went to look and I couldn't find them. But I did see a lot of Chinese small shops in the market in Tanzania and Zambia and other places where I went. So this is definitely on the rise. And I also found things like in Tanzania, there were Chinese who had come in on saying that they were investors And they had gotten permission then to bring in 5 people to work with them. They got 5 work permits. And some of the ones that I talked to who had come in as investors were trading. And so they weren't actually investing. And they said to me, we're still looking for the right project. But they'd been there a few years at that point and still were trading. And the Tanzanians said they didn't have any way to follow up on these people who had gotten this permission once they'd gotten it. So there is some interesting work on this. There's a professor, Nina Sylvanus, who's right now, she's at one of the California universities. She's a student at UCLA and is now somewhere on a temporary line, I think. But she's done some very interesting work on these, in the textile trading sector. And I recommend her work to you on Chinese traders and African traders' responses to that. It's very, very nice empirical work. In the far back there?
My question is that based on the research that you've done on the ground, did you see that there was a transfer of technology where the Chinese who are engaging these activities are actually employing local Africans working with them, so that when the everyone who's over, the Africans can take over their stuff and bring about sustainability?
What the Chinese found in their earlier decades of doing aid was that very often they have a whole system set up about how to transfer the technology and train and so on. And they found that they had a lot of difficulty getting African governments to assign counterparts in a timely fashion. And so the Chinese have this reputation, they come, they do the work, they leave. So they would come, they would do the work, they would ask for counterparts to be assigned, the counterparts would not be assigned, and then they would leave and the technology would not be transferred. And so what they're doing now is they're trying to get away from that kind of aid. And so that's why they're using aid to build they're using aid with business. For example, these special economic zones are ways, and the $1 billion fund for African entrepreneurs to invest in the special economic zones in Africa. That's what they're doing now. They're trying to do it more business-oriented, so it'll be sustainable. I describe a whole, it's a long story, but what they're doing with agriculture is very much the same kind of model. They're using aid to get Chinese companies started out so they can find some agricultural technologies that have commercial viability that African farmers want to buy. And so that will make the aid sustainable and will also supply something for the African farmers. I have some questions about that. As I detail those in the book. But that's what they're doing. Now, what is, I think, more important in terms of transfer of technology is what's happening in the private sector. And when I talk to the Nigerians who are working with Chinese, they call them technical partners. Some of them are investing, but others are just technical partners. And these technical partners come in and they train. They train your people. And they train your people because you're paying them. So you pay them to do the training, and they don't leave until your people are trained. And so that seemed to me to be a very effective method for getting training going and technology to be transferred. So because the ownership is there and the desire to make it work is there. I have a lot in the book about the use of Chinese labor versus the use of African labor. And I think you'd be surprised how much African labor is actually employed by Chinese, whether they're manufacturing or working in construction. There are exceptions to that, but just to preview that, the data show that it's on average about 20% Chinese and 80% African in any given project. That's on average. And that's an average that combines all of the work that's being done in Angola, which is almost a half and half kind of model. Half Angolan, half Chinese. It was 45 to 55%. 45 Chinese and 55% Angolan on these construction projects. And then places like Egypt, where it was 95% Egyptian and 5% Chinese in the factories there. And Tanzania and Zambia are very much like that, 90 or 95% African. Let's see. You.
What are like African perceptions of Western versus Chinese aid? Do they see like Chinese aid seems to have these like more economic like transit kind of thing, and USA is like, oh, we're going to be very generous. Whether that's the truth or not, what is the perception of like African people towards that?
You know, I don't even think I can answer that because it gets into that thing about who are Africans. And, you know, we're talking about 53 countries here and a lot of different people. So I really can't presume to, it's always a danger to say, well, Africans think this about it. I just have examples of what people have said. And they say a lot of different things. Many people are very appreciative of the aid that they get from the West. And certainly there are a lot of things that they like about what we do there in our AIDS programs and other, I mean, our HIV/AIDS programs, many aspects of that, and other things that we do to assist.
Like, is Chinese exploitation like shown by the African media? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they repeat a lot of the same stories that are in our media, and then they have plenty of their own as well. But there's, there is a lot of concern amongst, and it goes into things like labor standards, environmental safety, social responsibility, these kinds of things. That's, I think, where their biggest concerns are. But let me just tell you one story that was told to me by one African minister. He said that when the Chinese come here, they really do listen to what we want, because they really want to do what we want. And in Sierra Leone, what the government wanted was a second stadium. And the Chinese said, why do you want a second stadium? You know, this is not a very good use of our aid. You already have a stadium that we built in the 1980s. You're just coming out of a war. You have all these infrastructure needs. Isn't there something else we could finance? And they insisted on a stadium. And so finally, the Chinese they're building a second stadium there. And I asked the Sierra Leonean ministers who were involved in this negotiation, I said, why did you ask them to build a stadium? And they said, they laughed. They said the Chinese really kicked against that. They didn't want to do it. But, you know, ultimately, they said it was a political thing for us, that we wanted the stadium to be located in the area where the war had been. We thought this was an area that could get young people involved, what have you. It was a political thing. You know, it was like a pork barrel thing into that area. And then the government changed. And then it became a political hot potato. They couldn't stop the project because it would have been seen as being against the opposition and that ethnic group in that area. So the Chinese didn't really want to do it, but at the end of the day, they did it. And then they compared this to what the Germans had done. GTZ came, and a German leader was there, and he announced that they were going to be giving, you know, like $40 million in aid or something like that. And the Sierra Leonean president said, oh, we will use this for our rural electrification program. And then the Germans went home. And a few weeks later, they got the notice from the Germans that it was going to be used for the German human security program. And they were like, oh, well, that's not what we wanted to use it for. So that's the example they gave me about, you know, how the other donors operate. Now, we're trying to promote ownership. And when ownership is a stadium, it's sort of, what do you do? The Chinese build a stadium. We wouldn't do that. But it was ownership. So it's an interesting dilemma. Yes?
I can speculate on a number of ways American policy might have opened the door to China. Particularly Public Law 480 in 1954 had a really devastating effect on agriculture around the world, especially cotton in Africa. And it may have been inadvertent, but it wasn't unanticipated that we did that. And there are other ways that we have had that kind of impact in Africa.
Well, I think structural adjustment and trade liberalization that came along with that. There were many things that needed to be done in policy change in African countries, kind of across the board. There were a lot of overvalued exchange rates and problems with prices that didn't reflect reality and so on. But they really threw the baby out with the bathwater, I think. And in having these sort of draconian levels of trade liberalization, it's made it very difficult for local industries, many of which needed to be shaken up somehow, but they were more than shaken up. They kind of died. And it also just opened up now, you can take that argument too far, because in Nigeria, for example, they have not liberalized the textile industry. They have bans on imports. But the imports still come in, they're smuggled in. And so that argument only goes so far. But I'm sure PL 480 was and continues to be, they're very aware of this, and yet there are these forces that push that excess food out the door. And it's very hard for us to restructure that, kind of like health reform. We know it's wrong, but it still continues. Yes?
Is
there any correlation in terms of the success of Chinese engagement in Africa between, say, we'll call them post-personality party states or former party states on the one hand, like the MPLA connection Angola or Mozambique or what have you, and the kind of chieftaincies, I don't know what else to call what happened in West Africa over the last few decades, or is it just kind of accidental where that you can see success and failure?
It's a very interesting question, and I think it would be great to do a kind of, I'd like to work with somebody on doing some kind of typology like that, to sort that out. Because I could have I think enough of a sense of where it's been successful and where it hasn't. We could develop some criteria to make that standardized, and then we can, but I can see how that would be interesting to do. I don't have an overall impression of that. I know that the Chinese way of really emphasizing non-interference in domestic affairs means that it's easy for them to move from one leader to another. And so when one leader goes out, they just deal with the next leader because they have tried not to get too involved in the domestic politics. And so it also made it pretty easy for them to move from supporting UNITA to being friends with the MPLA. So, which is what they did in Angola, and that's one of their more successful partnerships. Nigeria's been a lot more problematic for them, but then they've worked well in other parts of West Africa. So I'm not sure how much that is the style of governance in Nigeria and how much is the scale. Yeah, Nigeria is really tough. Yeah, I've been working there on and off since 1987, so it's a challenging place for the Chinese as well. Very challenging. Yes?
Who writes the rules for the special economic zones? Are they the same in all the special economic zones? And who enforces them?
These, well, I assume you're talking about the ones in Africa, or are you talking about the ones in China? Well, the ones in China were set up in the beginning. Shenzhen was in particular a zone of experimentation. And so there were some kinds of rules, but they were allowed to experiment. And so a lot of the things that happened in China's market liberalization, a lot of things were tried out there first to see if they would work or not. So they didn't really have, it wasn't like someone wrote the rules about everything that they could do, although there was an overall framework. So, and then these various other zones, there are a lot of different regimes for the zones in China. In Africa, surprisingly, I did a paper for the World Bank on this, and they were really surprised. They thought like the Chinese set like a standard. It's kind of one-size-fits-all kind of thing. People accuse the World Bank of being like that, one-size-fits-all. And they were sort of thinking the Chinese would be like that all of these zones would look the same. And it's not the case at all. The zones almost uniformly take they're under the regime of the local government. So, for example, Zambia has its own multi-facility economic zone legislation, and the Chinese zone follows that. And Mauritius has its free zone legislation, and the Chinese zone follows that, and so on, and the same in Nigeria. It's a standard that's set by the country. So there's nothing that's particularly special. No, I didn't. I thought that they would, but I didn't see any examples of that. Yeah, it's one of the questions we were looking at.
Let's just have a couple of final questions, take them together, and then, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in your conclusions about governance. And basically your conclusion was that it's basically this Chinese engagement has little effect. And it's just basically a continuation of the status quo. And I guess my question
That's what I predict.
Right, it's what you predict.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question was, like in what sense is the status quo in some cases digression when it's like progress foregone? So in one sense, does the Chinese presence empower countries to be more resistant to pressure from other donors that kind of encourage good government?
Okay, I guess we're going to take a few and then.
That's a very fascinating presentation. Just to remind you that when you began your study in 1991 or so, I was at Usuka at the time. I was studying a number of steps together, but differently. So when it
Thank you.
I think when you're talking about Chinese infrastructure, what they're building in Africa, and the degree of participation of local people. And we know that in any endeavor about development, human being is at the center of it. And so, if the degree of labor force participation in Africa of Chinese is 20%, and that of African 80%. The question is, what level of Africans participate in these projects? Are they able to take control after Chinese have gone? If they are not able to take control after Chinese are gone, then I see this as a phase that will pass, and then we go back to square one. So what is the quality and level of people who participate? And are those people able to take control of development on those projects when Chinese are gone?
Okay, let's have one more. So you're saying that the involvement of the Chinese in the internal affairs of the countries in Africa is not really intense. Then my question to you would be, how do they handle investments gone bad? Because I would assume that high share, even more important projects, as you mentioned in Nigeria, I think, have actually gone bad. So what sort of levers do they have to handle that?
Any more, or should I answer now? Okay, let me answer. All right, let me start first with this, the question about the status quo. This is, again, something I would love to do a research paper when we have a little more data about this, particularly if we had data on these flows of development finance to particular countries that was reliable, which we don't have. When I say the status quo, I don't actually mean that there won't be change. And that is what the status quo means. That's probably the wrong term to use. What I mean is that I don't think the Chinese will, I think their impact will be marginal, so that the changes that will happen in these countries will happen. For example, in Angola, the Chinese are very deeply involved, but their governance has been improving. They're becoming more transparent. They've been listing the signature bonuses that they're getting from oil companies. There's a lot on the Ministry of Finance website about the oil revenues. So a lot of things or some things have been changing there, although they didn't hold their elections as scheduled. But there, and other countries as well, I think that the Chinese being there is not going to be the critical factor that makes a difference in the future of good or bad governance in countries. So just to clarify that. And I know many people fear that this Chinese finance is going to lure countries away from the better donors, the ones that are more, impose conditions and for their aid, which the Chinese don't, except for the Taiwan condition and the Tide aid condition. But I don't see that because the Chinese fund such different things than the regular donors do. There's so many other needs that they're not meeting. So I think there's still going to be a lot of demand for the services of the regular donors. The few things where there will be a difference is in the big infrastructure projects that the World Bank used to fund or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development would like to fund. That's where the competition is going to be. And that's where there might be lower environmental social standards coming out because the Chinese are not as demanding for those things. Although there are some signs that may be changing. It's still not at the level of banks that sign up to the Equator Principles, for example. On the local labor, what seems to be the case is that in Chinese government-sponsored construction projects, this is almost overwhelmingly that layer of Chinese, which is on average about 20%, it varies, will be at the highest level of the management and the technical skilled staff. And so the African staff will be at the less skilled level. But that changes country by country. In Tanzania, for example, the surveyors, the bookkeepers, the people, the engineers, these are African. because Tanzania has a fair number of educated people, and so the Chinese companies, perhaps more importantly, have been there a long time, and so they have a whole staff that they know and that they use. But in a place like Angola, when I was looking at the data on the Chinese versus Angolans, a lot of the projects that I saw, they list the Chinese and what their skills were, the engineers and all of the various things, and then Angolans, it said porters and drivers. And so that's not an area where you're going to be seeing very much technology transfer. But it really varies project by project. And in the private sector projects, there are far fewer Chinese coming in, and there's these ones in Nigeria that I was looking at, there's complete control of all of the levels of management by the Nigerian side. So these are just Chinese engineers coming in as technicians, as technical assistants. So there are a lot of different models there. Now, finally, on investments gone bad. Who asked that question? There's you. It's interesting because there have been investments that have gone bad, and I wish I knew. I would love to know more about what they've been doing in Nigeria on this big railway project. You can find out quite a bit. Reading the Nigerian newspapers is always interesting, if not always. You can't always be sure that you're getting the real story, but you get little tidbits about it. And what I know is that these deals these days are structured often using New York-based law firms like White & Case in their Beijing office. They advise the Chinese on these deals, and so they're very tightly structured. So that railway deal is going to go forward. I don't think they have too many big penalties they have to pay if they don't go through with that contract in some form and negotiate that. And they don't regard that as interference in domestic affairs if they're trying to get their contract back on track, so to speak. And in Zimbabwe, it was the same thing. They were, constantly going around to the government and saying, we have all these contracts, you owe us all this money, pay, when are you going to pay? And I'm sure they do it more politely, but they don't regard that as interference either. So there's an idea that the Chinese use debt relief, or they're going to use these big loans politically somehow, and I haven't seen any sign of that. For example, Zimbabwe was supposed to be a big friend of China. They got no debt relief. In all of the debt cancellations that the Chinese did across Africa, they didn't cancel them in Zimbabwe. And they didn't cancel them in several other countries that were supposed to be good friends as well. So they canceled them in the countries where it was practical, the HIPC countries for the most part. And then there are a few exceptions, but not in Zimbabwe.
All right. Before we conclude, by the way, I'll get to talk to you about the railway in Nigeria, because I, in fact, happened to have had a conversation with the Minister of Transportation on, about
interesting case.
And they once paid a huge penalty. There should right now be a single-track railway in Lagos, which they didn't go ahead with and had to pay a tremendous penalty on. But I just wanted to just conclude, because when I started off my introduction, I mentioned how this book really, pulls across veils in so many areas. And one of those is on China in the world, the Go Global. When I talked about the toolkit, it's a toolkit in terms of African developing countries, but it is the toolkit to support this outreach of, moving out with companies and so on. And since you use anecdotes so effectively in your book, I'll just give you one anecdote. And this has to do with how countries like the US and others are themselves reacting to what's happening with this China in the world. I guess maybe it would be about like 18 months or so ago, I arrived in Accra, Ghana for a conference. And there's a senior US government official, whose name I won't mention because he's back in a senior position, who arrived with us. And so the embassy had sent a car to collect us. It was very interesting that on the way there, of course, we could see, and this happens in all the airports in Africa now. You just be so conscious of the Chinese arriving, lining up there to come in, and you could just look at them and you can get a sense of these are workers and so on. And there was some, as we arrived in Accra, but it's really something from the airport all the way to our hotel where we were staying. The official was asking this embassy official, really grilling him about the Chinese. So I'm sitting in the car and I'm listening to this conversation as he's quickly trying to get an update, you know, of what they are, what they're doing, what they're coming into, and so on, you know. And so sort of publicly, we don't talk about that. And in fact, even if a question is asked, for example, of Hillary Clinton, are we doing this because of the Chinese and so on? They say, no, 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 no. And you point out, for example, infrastructure. They turn around, the Chinese are doing infrastructure. All of a sudden, we have to get in and doing infrastructure, right? But it's really getting a sense that the Chinese toolkit is so very effective. You know, most of the rest of the world is going to find itself, you know, copying or trying to play catch-up. And in some regards, I feel they cannot, you know, because they're not Chinese. So anyway, that's my view. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.